Dr. Paul, what will this do to the practice of medicine if you have to report to the federal government what your patient tells you? A conversation that the Supreme Court has said is the most private and immune from government intrusion that we can have, the patient-physician conversation. You as a physician, if you were to follow this, instead of going into the Senate, would have to report to some federal bureaucrat what your patient told you and be guided or even regulated by the federal bureaucrat as what you can do. Are American doctors trained to be subject to the intrusion and commands of federal bureaucrats when it comes to treating their patients?
Well, so much do they want this to be electronic records that they're actually giving doctors $40,000 apiece to change their office to electronic records, but then they also want access to those electronic records. So it does concern me about patient privacy, and I don't really want the government looking at my records or any other patient records. I think it's a real danger. I was in the state capitol today, though, talking about trying to get our Attorney General in Kentucky to join the lawsuit against this, and we had 300 people there, and it's part of this Tea Party movement. People are not happy, but there's still great momentum out there in the countryside to try to change this.
What does the financial community think about this? I mean, do they think that this is a left-wing politics run amok?
You know, it's funny.
Or do they think there's a way for this to work?
We've been talking all day about Jamie Dimon coming out and saying that we were sick of being demonized by the federal government, by some of the bureaucrats in Washington. Listen, Wall Street supported Obama in a major way.
Right.
Unprecedented. Goldman Sachs
that was then.
That was 4 times more to McCain, to Obama than they gave to McCain-Palin.
Right.
Right now, they are really worried, and it's not just the rhetoric. They are worried that, you know, instead of reforming health care, we've created a new entitlement. Instead of maybe helping the people at the bottom end of the ladder, well, you know, we're redistributing wealth. They are really worried about what this does to the deficit. They may not go public with it, but you could talk to every single Wall Street CEO, and they can't believe he turned to this instead of deficit reduction.
Aren't you worried as a patient advocate that innocent human beings, whether they're healthy 20-year-olds or 75-year-olds who need to see a physician more regularly, will be powerless here? There is a clause in here that prohibits an appeal from a decision of a bureaucrat. So if a bureaucrat says to Dr. Paul, you may only perform this service on this patient, that decision is final and absolute.
Right. And doctors will be constantly forced to choose between doing what's right for their patients and avoiding a government penalty. You know, women's rights advocates who have fought for 30 or 40 years for a woman's right to choose on reproductive issues and a woman's right to keep her medical records private need to reassess the impact of this law on their values, because whether you're pro-life or pro-choice, you lose under Obamacare.
Dr. Paul, can you bring yourself to put down in the government laptop everything your patients tell you and wait for the government to come back and say, okay, doctor, we've decided that this is the procedure, this is the medicine, and this is the budget?
Yeah, no, and being a physician is really not about following an allogram and everything is out of a cookbook. I think there is some intelligent interaction, and the choice is not always the same as what comes out of a book. So I don't think that's the way we want to practice medicine. Talking about the cost, you know, the Congressional Budget Office said that the prescription drug plan would only cost $400 billion. It's costing $1 trillion. The implications of this, they say they're going to have $500 billion in savings from Medicare, but it's based on assumptions that Congress gave to them. It's not based on reality, and when you make something free, it gets overutilized, and that's what will happen here. It'll cost 2 and 3 times as much as they say it will cost.
And there's this crazy thing in there, Charlie, about the Reserve Corps, the 6,000 person.
I don't even know what to make of that.
That the president can put together. He can conscript doctors from the state National Guard and make them work for the federal government.
He's bringing back the draft.
He almost is bringing it back. I mean, where is that going to go? Are we going to get to a system like Great Britain where the healthcare providers are employees of the government?
That's what it looks like. I mean, we're at least moving in that direction. Obviously, there's going to be a fight over this. What I don't understand, and maybe the doctor can explain this, how did the AMA ever support this nonsense?
That's shocking, but remember that only 17% of physicians belong to the AMA, and many of them are not physicians who actually care for patients.
What physicians in their right minds could support this, Dr. Paul?
Right. And I think this actually will lower their membership. The AMA has been struggling for years, and they do not represent doctors across the country. And AAPS has been growing dramatically as doctors who want to fight against big government join together under a different banner. But the AMA doesn't represent me. I've never been a member of the AMA, and they don't represent my position in supporting Obamacare.
Do federal judges have the moral courage and fortitude to look at this thing and say, this did not come from the Constitution?
I believe they will. And in fact, there's a very important case, Gonzalez versus Oregon, which was just decided a couple of years ago, that made it very clear that the federal government does not have the power to regulate the practice of medicine or impose medical standards and regulate how doctors treat patients.
Dr. Ron Paul, former Lieutenant Governor Betsy Coy, my colleague Charlie Gasparino, thanks for joining us. It's Census Day. The government says you must answer a bunch of questions about what does the Constitution require? We'll be right back. If you haven't heard already, it's Census Day, which is the deadline for everyone to return their U.S. Census form, unless you want to visit from a federal worker. The forms count the number of people in each household and are used to allocate federal money and congressional seats. But some will be asked dozens of questions about intimate private behavior that occurs within the household. Plus, the government will demand each form that you receive be answered or you pay a fine. Is this constitutional? Is it an invasion of privacy? Here to explain, Kevin Gutzman. He's an associate professor of history at Western Connecticut State University. He's also the author of the terrific book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution. And Ilya Shapiro, he's a senior fellow in constitutional studies at the Cato Institute and the editor-in-chief of the Cato Supreme Court Review. Ilya, to you first. Has the Supreme Court itself ever declared whether or not the questions beyond how many persons reside in this house as their principal residence are constitutional?
There is some what's called dicta, meaning kind of offhand remarks from a very old case about 140 years ago to the effect that it is. But that was not at all the case presented before the Supreme Court, so there really is no four-square ruling on the question.
Have lower federal courts, Kevin, looked at the questionnaire that was sent out a few weeks ago? I'm talking about the one that asks about nationality, religion, ethnicity, gender, number of bathrooms, when you go to work, when you go to bed, those type of personal questions. Has any court scrutinized those questions?
Not in any case that I'm aware of. No.
All right. So how do we get from the Constitution saying, well, we have to have a House of Representatives, so we have to know how many people live there, because the House of Representatives is apportioned by population. How do we get from that in the Constitution to this 20-page form that wants to know everything about me?
Well, the reason is that we have a nanny state, and people in the federal government want to have all kinds of details about your personal life so that they can, down the road, legislate about them.
Does the government have the right to ask this stuff, Ilya? I mean, isn't there a basic right to privacy which says I don't have to tell you, even though it's not going to kill me to say it, but I have a certain sense of personal dignity that I don't want the government to come across the threshold of my front door?
Right. Well, there's two issues here. First of all, does the government have the power? And I would say it doesn't, because the Article 1, Section 2 says that an enumeration shall be made, indeed, for the apportionment of representatives in Congress. Beyond that, it's silent. And on the other hand, people do have a right to privacy and to not having to do things when the government commands them to do things. We have all sorts of rights. So on both of those sides, this is a questionable practice. And as you've said, some of these questions are just ridiculous. Like, do you need help? How many people in your household need help bathing or dressing, for example?
Well, why does the government want to know this stuff? I mean, how does this advance the cause of government? What is the source of their appetite for this information?
Well, there's a difference between the appetite and what's constitutional. Of course, these people have the idea that
Talk to me about the appetite.
Well, I think they want to improve every aspect of your life, whether it's the filament in the light over your head or the plunger in your toilet. And before they can do that, they have to know how many plungers and how many filaments you have. So essentially, they have an unconstitutional program, and they intend to further it by first gathering information about you. I think one point, though, that needs to be made is that not only do we not have any grant to Congress a power to do this kind of thing, but we have an explicit reservation of all the powers that aren't granted to the states. So the
or to the people respectively.
That's right. So the 10th Amendment stands explicitly for the idea that Congress should not be doing this.
Ilya, as I understand the law, a lot of people email me about this, so we did the research. The government can fine you $100 for every unanswered question, $500 for every wrongfully answered question, a maximum of $5,000 for whatever you do on the form that the government doesn't like, and there's no jail time involved. Do you think people are just going to send the government a check and tell them to go take a hike?